Is hiring a VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion a Christian value? Are we dumb for finding value in what is a woman? Are the fruits of socialism actually human rights? We take on these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through our social media feeds. We find takes of all kinds, good, bad, and anything in between. And we critique them or laud them as they deserve. My name is Donald. I'm here with my co-host Britt. Before we get started, just a reminder to subscribe if you are watching on YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast if you're listening and you like what you hear. You can follow us on socials at Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. Without further ado, let's get started into the takes. So our first take, it is in response to the somewhat new news, not by now, but relatively recent news that Chick-fil-A has hired a DEI officer. So the first, the take we're going to be critiquing is quote retweeting someone who's reporting that, who tweets, "We have a problem. Chick-fil-A just hired a VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. This is bad, very bad. I don't want to have to boycott. Are we going to have to boycott?" And then we have someone who quote retweets them saying, I think this is supposed to be a typo. I'm going to try to interpret it as best I can.
Think it's many.
Aside. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Many of the responses to him are that they thought Chick-fil-A had Christian values. Apparently, supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion is anti-Christian. Fascinating take. What do you take of that, or think about this take here, Brett?
We're to be clear, we're not taking on Joey.
Correct.
We're taking on the person saying that DEI is not anti-Christian.
Yes.
You know, I think about the verse that came to mind, and I'm critiquing this as a Christian, so from a Christian standpoint. So, you know, a lot of people that are listeners that are either atheists or agnostic that maybe don't hold the Bible as part of the authority system, it doesn't really, your opinion doesn't apply here because we're specifically talking about Christianity. And so it's, what does the Christian faith have to say about this issue? And I thought specifically of the verse where Jesus talks about how the path is narrow and the gate is narrow, and it's very, very difficult, right, to walk along the straight path to get to Jesus, that he is the way, the truth, and the life, which in and of itself is an exclusionary statement, right? It means that there is no other way to come to the Father except through him. By him saying that, to broaden that out, he's basically saying that there is, from a Christian perspective, there is a design that we are meant to live by, and life is best served, I wouldn't even say better, is best served and only served by living according to that design. And when we stray away from that design, which was that, God made man and women in his own image to be married and to procreate, when we stray from that, we end up with bad things. And so that's not to say that, like, valuing other types of people that have different backgrounds or cultural differences, that we want to have a society that works best for everyone, that you, within your personal life and in private organizations that you own or in control of, that you want to be inclusive of people and live, in a way that way. That's not to say that that's wrong, but like the terms diversity, equity, inclusion have been hijacked, and the meaning that this person is assigning to them is actually anti-Christian. It's not that those terms, taken in of themselves in the way that we probably would have understood them from the most of history, is anti-Christian. It's the fact that they've been reassigned. And again, like, I always find it funny that people that aren't Christians want to critique Christianity from a standpoint of, that they don't actually have any, they don't have put any stock in the Bible as the actual authority. Because it's like, well, if you're going to critique Christianity, you have to critique it from the standpoint of the Bible. You can't really critique it. That's not to say you can't critique it outside of it, but if you're critiquing Christianity as in, like, what does Christianity say about this, you have to use the Bible to do that. If you're not willing to do that, then you're not really adding anything to the conversation.
Yeah. It's always so typical to see the, maybe at best this person isn't a Christian, just because I would, if they are, I would say that this is a perversion, probably of the meaning of the gospel. So there's probably less hope than if they are yet to be a Christian. But the outsider take on this is always really funny. The person saying, well, your set of principles that I don't even purport to stand by say this or that, and then they'll, misconstrue it to whatever the popular agenda wants out of them or means. And that's what's going on here. So this to me is just like the you can't be pro-life unless you're a litany of other things. And this is the exact same thing. Oh, diversity, equity, and inclusion are bad things. And it's like in their proper contexts, these things can have merit and value, but it's all about the context. And so to bury your head in the sand and to play along and think, oh, if if they hire a VP of DEI, that means nothing else other than you're supporting the value of diversity in its best sense, equity in its best sense, and inclusion in its best sense, then you really are just burying your head in the sand to the modern meaning of those, which is to say, pretty anti-civil rights takes of unequal hiring, judging people by the content. Not of their character, but of their, the quality of their skin and those kinds of things, and their external attributes and their gender identity and things like that. Those are the qualities that DEI people tend to bring in, and those things are against Christian values, right? Because Christ said, or well, Paul says, in there is neither Jew nor Gentile, man nor woman. He gets rid of all of these categories. What we are all one in Christ. It's not to say that these distinctions aren't real and don't exist, but the idea is that's not how we judge people. That's not how you base someone's worth or value. And that's what the modern DEI really does. It distills you into these categories of what your value is in this way, and then you make decisions based on these externalities. That is anti-Christian. The individual values of diversity, when you're talking about like diversity of thought or diversity of believer, well, that's also one of the things Paul talks about there. There isn't Jew nor Gentile. You have a diversity that's all unity in Christ. Inclusion, you include Jew and Gentile, man and woman, all that kind of stuff. But this person doesn't want to actually acknowledge the reality of what a VP of DEI is. Something tells me this person probably would also say, "Oh, the Patriot Act is very patriotic."
Yeah, that's exactly what I was just going to say. Is that this person would believe that the Anti-Inflation Act,
Yeah.
is where we print more money, which is the exact reason we got into this mess in the first place. Is well, it's a good thing because it says anti-inflation. It's like, well, no, look at the principle that this actually serves. And you said a really good thing, which is like, well, what is the end result of hiring a VP of diversity, equity, inclusion? Does it mean that these company becomes more diverse? Does it have more equity in it? Is there more inclusive actions based on people's actual merit and all these sorts of things? It's like, no, it's not. It actually turns out it's the opposite, and lots of crazy things happen. We've seen this happen at every single company that has any sort of HR DEI policy in place, that you get people hired on that shouldn't have been there in the first place. They're actually further discriminated in some ways, not because they are part of a minority group, but because they shouldn't have been there in the first place based on merit, right? And so recruiters and the people who are sourcing these candidates and things like that are incentivized to hire people that are not qualified for it just because they check a certain type of box, whereas it's like there might be externalities that mean that it's kind of like that James Damore guy who had the memo about like why the majority of computer engineers are men is because the majority of people, it's like at the time when he wrote it was like 85% of the people that go into that discipline in school are men, and they have a disproportionate interest in it. And so therefore any company's makeup, if they have 85% of the engineers are men, that's not because there's some crazy thing going on. It means that they're actually representative of the people that are interested in it. We see this also play out in like Scandinavian countries when they become more, when there's more equity, then when it's more egalitarian, the differences between men and women become more pronounced because everyone feels like they're able to choose what they actually want to do. And that's at the core of this DEI stuff is saying that there are no substantive differences between people that might have different interests, and that yields into different real world outcomes, which in a way is incredibly racist, is incredibly dismissive, and is incredibly exclusive. It's saying that everyone needs to have the same value set and everyone needs to have the same sort of interest, and that basically we want to force, if we could, we'd force it to be 50-50, have all, if we don't have 50-50 interest in computer engineering between men and women, then we're going to force it to happen. We're going to force women to have interest in computer engineering. That's where the inevitable conclusion of this type of thought process leads you. And ergo, it's not actually letting people be free to choose, which is actually very exclusionary. It's not inclusive.
Yeah. So to sum it up, I guess when you sort of corporatize or institutionalize the idea of DEI, right? You take these nebulous concepts and you turn them into this modern amalgamation. One, you don't get the things that they actually purport to do because it's just the worst versions of them. And two, you end up alienating and isolating people in the worst ways. So,
Yeah.
so you don't get people's true diversity of what they want to do and their freedom to express. But you do get diversity in that you single out and isolate people based on irrelevant fact. Well, not irrelevant necessarily to everything, but just immutable characteristics that ought not to be judged on in the ways in which these people make these discernments and judgments. It's the worst of both worlds, and I don't think Christianity has much to do with that. So, bad first take here.
Yeah.
We'll move on to our next one. This one comes from Nick Freitas. He is a Virginian legislator. He tweets, "Here is how it works. Somebody points out something the left is pushing towards kids. A leftist says it's a lie. You provide evidence that it is happening. Then, instead of saying, 'Oh, I didn't realize that,' they immediately move to defend it and attack you. Hashtag gaslighting." What do you make of this take here?
It's a good take. It's a good take because it's true. I mean, you think about just 3 years ago, people were talking about the drag queen story hour here in Seattle at the Seattle Public Library. Like, oh no, you guys are using this slippery slope argument about all this stuff, and oh no, we're not trying to normalize pedophilia or anything like this. And now, fast forward, one of the colors. I was just at a corporate store here in Seattle, and like they had freaking the pride flag broken out, and they had all the different colors like illuminating what each color meant. And it's like I can't remember the exact color for it, but they had one for maps, minor attracted persons. It's like,
Oh my
dude,
gosh.
here we are, that it's on a corporate company's wall with basically saying like, oh yeah, part of the identifier for this flag and one of the stripes and it is for minor attracted persons or maps, which
Good grief.
of the old, just 3 years ago would have been known as a pedophile. So yeah, and this is kind of indicative of their entire strategy, right? It's like they're constantly moving the window of what is acceptable conversation, and to the point where like things that you would have argued against as like, hey, we shouldn't be doing that 3 years ago, now become like, oh no, this is guaranteed, and then they can kind of move on to the next one. I mean, the very definition of gas lamping, people.
Yeah. No, that's. I mean, the example that comes to mind for me, in this with this particular take when I think about it, is that one video, and I wish I could remember where I saw it or who it was. And it wasn't that long ago, but it was talking about the hospital that the documents had just come out and revealed was doing, quote unquote, gender affirming care, but they were, mutilating children essentially, as young as I want to say 5 years old or something like that. Maybe it was 8, but it was very, very young regardless. And so there was this guy, this journalist who was outside of that clinic, and he was street interviewing people about it. And he asks this one individual, "Hey, do you think it's okay that hospitals are taking children as young as let's just go with the higher number here because I don't remember. Let's say 8, as young as 8 years old, and doing irreversible surgery involving their genitalia because of the parents wanting them to be transitioning." And the guy's immediate first reaction was, "Oh no, that's not happening." And he's like, "Well, no, it's literally happening at that hospital right there." And then he's like, "Well, we don't know the full circumstances." And one by one, I wish I could remember which it is. You might be able to find it by looking it up. But one by one, this guy keeps denying every step of the way. He's like, "Well, if I don't think he said it's as young as 8 years old. I think he just said on children." He's like, "Well, if they're, I mean, I don't think it's okay for children. I don't think they're doing it for children." Like, no, they're doing it for children. He's like, "Well, if they've really thought about it a long time," and he's like, "Well,
Ugh.
no, they don't. They're doing it as soon as like 2 months." And the guy's like, "Well, what right do you have?" It boils down to the guy saying basically like, "Well, it's not happening. Well, if it is happening, it's okay if it's adults. Well, even if it's children, it's okay with parents' consent. Well, even if it's not parents' consent, if they've had this, process going for a long time. Well, even if it's not a long time, what right do you have?" That's the way the conversation goes. So it's
Within a few
absolutely
minutes.
true. Yeah, within like 2 minutes or something. Exactly. Maybe not even 2. So this I will I'll try to find this video if I can, and we can put it in the show notes if I can find this. But it was absolutely incredible, and that's exactly what he's describing here. And what I would argue is that I think that right now, culturally speaking, it is more prevalent on the left. But I would say this kind of gaslighting and this kind of
It
denial
happens on the right
happens
too.
on the right too. Yeah, absolutely. And the most prominent example I think of is I think a lot in the cult of Trump right now. A lot of people who will apologize for everything Trump does or says. I've seen it with vaccine stuff, where,
Yep.
even Trump himself is saying New York had a better record than Florida because he's petty against DeSantis. And you'll see his Trump people like mocking and making fun of DeSantis after that. And it's like literally not that long ago, you were cheering for DeSantis because DeSantis was saying,
Yes.
I'm pro Trump. So this
Eh,
definitely happens, but I would say right now, culturally, the left is the more dangerous and involving children, usually, unfortunately.
Yeah, when you encounter this type of stuff, I think in the real world, what it's indicative of is there's a study done about people having realizing that a long held belief that they've had is actually wrong. And psychologically, what happens is it's the same level of stress. The brain, the imaging on the brain revealed the same level of stress and brain activity as when you had like a family member die or you lost a job or were fired or something similar to that. So very, very stressful event to have a long held belief totally crumble right in front of you and be dismantled. And most people react aggressively. And they react in the 5 stages of grief. So they deny quite a bit right at the beginning. They bargain. They do this and this and that. And so when you think about like when someone now has like politically we become so polarized and we become so this is my guy or this is my category or whatever I belong to. I'm a Joe Biden person or I'm a Donald Trump person. Let's just use the Trump people because we pick on the left quite a bit on here. People are so like, oh, I just love Trump, he can do no wrong. And then suddenly you present evidence in front of them saying like, oh yeah, he actually is kind of a loser. He kept Fauci in there. He didn't actually build the wall. He didn't actually, drain the swamp. He had some of the swampiest people actually in there deceiving him and keeping us in wars and such. And then he lost, the election. And so, Ron DeSantis, actually did a great job. And you do say, you led all the examples. You attack it and you provide examples of it. And so suddenly they have to either rationalize like, oh yeah, my belief in this person for the past 4 years has been misfounded and I can be deceived, which is a very painful thing. It's very rare for someone to actually come to terms with that. Or they can start rationalizing all of the decisions, which most of the time comes in the form of, well, Trump is just playing 4D chess.
Yeah,
I don't think Trump can even really play checkers, to be honest with you. But he's just jump up and throw off the board, and there's something like kind of impressive about that. But yeah, they usually rationalize that. We've had takes like that before about the reason why certain people have lost or they've voted yes on certain bills, and it's just 4D chess. It's like, no, you should just realize that you were wrong to support this person. They're actually a scumbag. Trump is actually a loser. He isn't actually on your side. He really is the egotistical maniac, just not in the ways that the left makes him out to be, right? He's actually good on certain things, but it's because it's in service of his ego. And once you realize that, then you can kind of move forward and see the world as it actually is. But that's the problem with all this stuff, right? We polarize so much and we get behind it that no one views ideas and positions as like clothes. It's kind of ironic, Sam Harris. I really like this analogy that he had, which is like, hey, like ideas and positions are like clothes. Like try them on. If they look good, they actually like serve a purpose, and they actually like are true to fit, right? That's like then keep them on. But if they're not, just take them off. It's like no one ever gets an opinion or gets like really grumpy about the fact that like, hey, I got a shirt that was too large for me or something like that, or a shirt that just doesn't look good. And people are okay like changing their clothes and realizing like, oh yeah, the positions I held, a year ago, I've come to realize they're not as good, and now I've moved on. Ironically, Sam Harris doesn't live up to that. He kind of keeps his position even when he looks like a fool, and it's proven wrong. But yeah, we'd all be better served if we could do more of that, and we'd avoid these types of things. And like you're saying, it happens on both the left and the right.
yeah. I will say I think the two examples of this coming recently, of people admitting sort of they were wrong, or like I didn't know this was happening to this degree, I would say is recently Megyn Kelly had a little monologue that went semi-viral about using pronouns and the trans issue in general. And she was like, I was one of the earliest advocates for just using people's pronouns. I thought, like, why should we cause offense when it's just such a simple thing for me to do, and blah blah blah. And then it just kept going and kept going, and then I realized I was wrong. Like, this has gone too far, and I made a mistake here. And then similarly, a Washington journalist who used to work for Como, um, Brandy Cruz, she was very pro COVID lockdown. And she recently came out and said, I'm admitting something I've never said before. This is I'm the most embarrassed I've ever been over anything about
Wow.
supporting this kind of stuff. It is the worst mistake I've ever made, because I thought, I practically begged Dow Constantine to arrest people who were, going out of lockdown and stuff. And I didn't see it. And so it's really good. That kind of thing should be met with like yeah, that is correct. That's good. Recognize that. And then, maybe if you were in a position of power during that time, maybe you should not be given the reins of power again. But I mean, for those people, like, they didn't technically have any sway or power over it, maybe just some sway. So I think them coming out and admitting that is very powerful. So hopefully there's more of that.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, moving on. Okay, so this one comes from a content creator named G-Link. He does like documentaries and stuff, and generally speaking, I follow him not because I agree with him on a lot of things, but I think he's generally an interesting thinker most of the time. Unfortunately, I'm not so sure that's what's going on here. So he G-Link uh, takes a screenshot of Elon Musk, who is sharing the Daily Wire's "What Is a Woman" documentary. Elon Musk saying every parent should watch this, talking about what is a woman. And G-Link tweets saying, "This whole thing is so fake and gay. Millions of dollars in funding a whole production crew and political organization, and the best they can come up with is, what is a woman? Wow, really thought-provoking question. Herder, what is a woman?" And then says some not so nice things after that. What do you think of this take here,
Well,
Britt?
I guess I don't. Is he being
He's saying the
anti-documentary?
Yeah, he's saying the documentary is like, oh man, you pour all this money and resources, and that's what you come
Oh,
up with. What is
okay.
a woman? Like, wow, good question, guys.
See, if I thought if it was satirical, I actually think this is a pretty funny comedy bit, right? Because
Right, right.
because it'd be the realization that like the brilliance of the documentary is that is a dumb question. It's a question we shouldn't have to ask, but we have to ask it because we've totally blown up the distinctions. Jordan Peterson talks about how biological sex, depending on like your viewpoint about how everything works, but like biological sex is kind of the fundamental building block of any sort of truth, right? It's even more fundamental than maybe even the concept of truth because you cannot procreate. Your lineage will not continue on unless you can properly identify, what is a member of the opposite gender
Yeah,
that you can actually procreate with. So it's a really interesting take on his end. That it's more fundamental than even the concept of truth itself. It's like bedrock. And so the fact that we're having to ask this question, I think, is what makes the documentary brilliant. This would be a really funny comedy bit if you were saying like, "Oh yeah, it's obvious. Everyone knows what this is. Why do we even need to ask it?" It's almost like, someone lived in a off grid in the desert for the past 30 years and then comes back. It's like, "Are we really asking this question?" It's like, "Yeah, we are, because we have to." And you'd be surprised, like, yeah, it's dumb to have to ask the question. What's even worse is that most people that are the people that are supposed to be experts and people teaching at college universities can't answer it properly. That's the actual like interesting part about the documentary. It's not the fact that you're asking the question; it's the fact that people can't have an answer for it, and that when that is posed to them, they come up with circular reasons and definitions, and it's just ridiculous. So yeah, it's a bummer because I kind of laughed at it if it was like tongue in cheek, right?
yeah,
Like, oh, you're so dumb you can't answer that. It's like, yeah, that's the whole point of the documentary, right?
yeah.
But go for it.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say I was really annoyed to see this. I responded, and I was being nice because, again, I genuinely think the guy usually doesn't have sort of the lowest common denominator take, but this and I did say as much. I'm like, hey, you're not a midwit, but this is a total midwit take. This is the absolute, like, I'm a level of sophistication above this simple question, but you're missing the entire point. And so you think you've gotten this great thing, like, oh wow, what a stupid, silly base thing. It's so much more complicated. But then it's the bell curve. You get to the highest level, and it's like, okay, so then what is a woman? Because if you think it's such a simple, dumb, bottom of the bell curve question, then you should easily be able to answer it. But the midwit take is, oh, that's so dumb. I don't even need to bother engaging with the material. It's so obvious. And so it struck me as someone who has not actually watched the movie, because the thing that I took away, and I think I said this either on the show, or I mean, I repeated it to most people I talked to about it after I'd seen it, which is the movie itself, the documentary itself wasn't like one of those documentaries that you walk away and you're like, I've learned so much. You don't walk away like, I
Yeah.
had no idea. But that's what
You've
makes it
seen so
profound.
much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is he is presenting this simple question and you've seen everyone avoid it. And that is what makes it profound. It's not that Matt Walsh has done some deep studies and he's uncovering this mystical knowledge that is was hitherto unknown, and he's putting together the pieces like he's national treasure, or something. It's it's that he's relentless in pushing this question and trying to figure it out. And the people, the forefront people who are willing to go on TV, the ones who are alleged experts in the field, cannot give him an answer. And that is what is profound about it. So this midwit take strikes me as, one, just dismissing it because you're like, oh, that's so obvious. And then you can't actually respond because you're being a midwit about it. And two, someone who hasn't actually seen the film to know how to engage with it. Because if your take is, wow, that's not a complicated question, yeah, that's
That's
the
the
point.
point.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. What's fantastic about it is, he does a great job, and at least in the first about 2/3 of the documentary, when he's having these conversations with these people that are having circular reasoning and all this stuff, he never actually puts forth he never puts forth his own definition of what a woman is. He only ever argues with the logic, the faulty logic that they put forward. So it's like it's really incredible, because it'd be really frustrating, to see all this stuff and have to sit through hours and hours of interviewing with these people saying these crazy things, and not put forth, an alternative viewpoint. But really, all he does is he's like, look, you there's one professor talking about, like, well, a woman is, it's anyone that identifies as a woman, and this is
Yeah.
supposed to be a college professor, at a prestigious school. And he's like, I know, but like, what is that? What is a woman? He's like, it's
Yep.
anyone who identifies as one. He's like, well, you can't use that in the definition, right? And they take that. The thing that really I took away from this was that when anyone was pushed, not with an alternative viewpoint, but with just, like a question about the logic of their definition, they became hostile. Like that guy,
Mhm.
like, threatened to get up and leave that interview. And so,
Yep.
like, Matt Walsh just let people talk, right? So it's like, yeah, like, it is a dumb question. It should be a dumb question, but the fact that we have to ask it, and the fact that one side of the aisle has zero answers for it, is really interesting. In the same way that, like, if we made a documentary about a cult of people that were just dying, and we asked them, like, well, why don't you drink water? It's
Yep.
like, well, that's the name of the documentary. It's like, why X tribe doesn't drink water? It's like, well, that's so dumb. Like, they should be drinking water, And it's like, well, the interesting part about the documentary is that they're not, right.
Yes.
They're not doing it, and they're dying anyways, and despite all the evidence to the contrary, they're still not doing it. It's like, that would make it really interesting. So I agree with you. Midwit take. I'll have to go. Is he like a political commentary guy,
He
or
does kind of a lot of different stuff. He does some stuff on politics. I don't remember where I originally found him. He's
is
not
he
huge.
libertarian or?
No, no, not really.
Okay.
I wish I could remember where I found him. I think he was criticizing something that I was like, oh, that's an interesting take, so I just gave him a follow. But
Hmm.
the yeah, and the thing too, about it is, like, even if, let's say, for the sake of argument, that G Link himself is like, no, I don't think it's as simple as, conservatives are making it. And I'm going to give the response about things like intersect people, or, hermaphrodites. What, and how do you how are you going to describe things in binary when the world doesn't operate in binaries all the way? Gives a more complicated answer. Let's say that, just for the sake of argument, he gives a very compelling and intelligent response that shows, no, this is not black and white. There's more gray areas here. Okay, cool. You can answer that. Why can't the people who are performing life altering surgeries and teaching in universities at the highest level in this field purportedly be the ones answering that? That is the scary part, right?
Yeah.
Because the if you're in the position where you have this information and you're considered an expert in the field, you should be, bursting at the seams with knowledge, and you should be itching for every opportunity to share that, especially with an organization of people who are hostile to your viewpoint, so that you can try to convert the most amount of minds on the issue. But the people who are the ones who are agreeing to this, the ones who are have the most control, the legislators who are involved, the university professors who are involved, the doctors who are involved, The ones with the most power in this particular instance can't answer the question. That alone should scare you, even if you have a cogent answer to the question that's not along the conservative line. Okay, we'll move on to our next take here. This one comes from, I'm going to mispronounce his name, I'm sure. So, Kasim Rashid, and he tweets, Americans, cancel student debt, cancel medical debt, make insulin free. Most of the developed world. What is student debt? What is medical debt? Insulin is already free. What GOP calls socialism, even conservative parties in most developed nations call a human right. What do you make of this take here, Brett?
Oh, it's a terrible take. I mean, it's so reminiscent of I saw this green text thread about like foreign countries criticize America saying, "Oh yeah, you guys are just so fat and stupid." And it's like, well, then how do you reconcile that in the Olympics, 3/4 of the medals are won by Americans and three
Yeah.
fourths of the best universities with the highest performers in the whole world are located in the United States. So America really is an exceptional country, right? And there are a lot of issues with things in it, but all of those issues stem from the socialism that this person wants to continue to bring. Countries like Norway and Sweden and all these places, they actually have really, really high capitalism in them. They have some of the highest degrees of economic freedom, in some ways even higher than the United States. They also have insanely high tax rates, right? Like you pay like 70% tax whenever you buy a car, things like that. And so, and this is also bolstered by, and this is obviously a no-go for a lot of people, but bolstered by certain types of cultural standards, right? When you actually take people from Sweden or Denmark and you transplant them into the United States, they actually do better than their counterparts in those countries because there's a culture of hard work and family-oriented, societies within those places, which yields, better results, more family wealth, more personal wealth, and just overall better outcomes, right? So there's a bigger pot to pull from, less freeloaders and things like that. And then when you transport them to a capitalistic society like the United States, which in a lot of ways has capitalized on the momentum from previous awesome decisions, they actually still do better than their counterparts. And so I think that kind of does away with that. So, you know, uh, just because you have just because you could swap the terms or whatever, saying that like, oh, we call it socialism here, and just because a socialist country somewhere else, like the quote unquote conservatives there, or even advocate for it or call it a human right, doesn't change that it is socialism, right? Doesn't change the reality of what that means. And then you're also comparing apples to oranges. But I'll let you. There's a lot to unpack, so I'll let you take the
Yeah,
rest of it.
yeah. Of course. Yeah, no, that what you just mentioned at the end there, that's what made me laugh the most about this is, what the GOP calls socialism, they would call a human right. And it's like, okay, but I mean, it's still socialism. That doesn't change the fact at all. And you can argue socialism includes human rights. That I mean, you can make that claim fine. But that's the thing that also stands out to me is at what where's the line? Why is medical debt and student debt and insulin, why are all those things human rights, but say the right to a certain standard of eating isn't, right? Like maybe a country ought to decide that in order for human rights to be met, you need everyone to access their own personalized, calculated diet for perfect health, and that the government needs to provide them. So now you need to have dietitians trained and recruited, and not by volunteering, but by force, to size up every single human and every citizen in your country. And then you need farmers and other nutritionists to create the foods that are required, and then provide that to them for free. Why are those not human rights? I don't. That's the biggest problem with these arguments, is that there's no definition of, when you're talking about things like terms of socialism or human rights and things like that. Like, we can talk about the outcomes and logistics, which I think you did already. But when you're talking about like the reason why we should have these things is because they are human rights by definition, you have to explain to me what a human right really is and why it stops at insulin. Why does it stop at insulin? Why doesn't it stop at like every single thing that could potentially help my health ever? Why doesn't it include like, a massage and a spa vacation every single day? Why is that not a human right? Because that can help your longevity. If you're not stressed out, that can help your longevity. If you're not having to work any sort of manual labor, if you're not having to to, lift things in your houses? Do you have a human right to movers for every single time you move a home in these countries? There's a million things that can be beneficial for a human that doesn't make it a human right. And so this person has to actually define their terms about what is or isn't a human right before you can even get into the semantic games of what matters, of if it's called socialism or if it's called human rights. That's less important to me unless you're going to actually do the work of defining what human rights means.
Yeah, I also I love the thought of like, well, just because they did it, so why can't we do it here? And it totally ignores the mechanism for which we
Yeah.
would use to cancel student debt and cancel medical debt and do all these things. It's like that was standing, right? Like just because my neighbor does it one way doesn't mean that we can also do it the same way. And I know exactly how we do it here, which is we would make the printing press go. And so the reason why we have so much student debt, so much medical debt, the reason why millennials and Gen Z will never be able to afford to buy a house, or if they do, they're going to have a crazy payment on it. The reason why your purchasing power has been divorced from the actual rate of production, per person in the United States, is because of the Federal Reserve, right? Like I saw this chart on Twitter just the other day, and it was basically like it charted production, like productivity per person compared to average wage per person or the minimum wage per person. And in 1971 they diverge, and it's like, well, what happened in the 1970s? It's like, oh, okay, well, we kind of we got divorced from actual sound money. We started printing money as much as we could and as much as we wanted. And it turns out if you don't have money to pay for something, like you have to have money to pay for something. It's just like a nonsensical thing to deal with. Like you can't just forgive debt. Someone pays for that debt. It might be the debtor that originally loaned the money. Maybe they lose out, but someone has to pay for it. Someone has to eat the cost of it at some point. And the mechanism by which we have addressed debt in the United States is with the printing of money by the Federal Reserve, which is just a tax on your future. The reason everyone is in such a bad place today, the reason the housing market is the way that it is, the reason food prices are so high is because of the Federal Reserve. And so regardless of whatever our neighbors do, however they've addressed it, with their 70% tax rates and things like that, the way we'd address it would actually make the actual situation much worse. And the things that you are complaining about would become worse. They would not become better. The actual root cause of this is we need to be more productive. We need to get back to sound money. We need to have proper signals within the market.
Yeah, I don't think I can put it better myself. All right. Our last take here comes from TJ Lucasen, who was actually an early guest on Cringe Posts. He tweets, the mere fact that the phrase trans man or trans woman exists is argument enough to show that no one really believes transition is possible. If it was possible, we'd simply say man or woman. But we say trans man just like we say imitation crab. What do you think about this take, Britt?
It's a fantastic take. I mean, it's very philosophical in nature, and you do see people trying to say like you see the phrase, trans woman is a woman,
Right.
and things like that, or trans men are men and things like that. But no one actually uses that. Like they actually refer to them as, oh yeah, that's a trans man or that's a trans woman, because language is rooted in rooted in action, is rooted in like, well, we say things and we classify things so that we know how to operate in the world, right? And just like I was talking about the Jordan Peterson quote, like biological sex and understanding the difference between them, that reality is more fundamental in a lot of ways than even the understanding that there is truth, because you and I wouldn't be here today if one of our ancestors wasn't able to understand that there's a difference between a man and a woman, right? Like you have to understand that to be able to procreate. And so it's embedded within all of our language. That's why we say trans man. It reminded me of when the Tennessee shooter at the Christian school, which was a trans man, which is a biological female that has transitioned to being a man. I remember when the sheriff was talking about it, and got really confused, to say things like, I think he was saying, he's like, oh yeah, it was a trans woman. What he meant was that it was a female, biological female that was trans man. It had transitioned to a man, but because like the entire language is so confusing, it makes it almost impossible to talk about this. Like he obviously got it confused, and he set off a whole whirlwind where people were thinking that this was actually like a trans woman, which would have been a man shot up the school when it was really a biological female that shot up the school. So yeah, like all this stuff, it's rooted in our ability to function, and the fact that we have these other terms for these people to describe them shows that no one actually believes that transition is possible.
Yeah, and this is one of those things where I think with time that can change. And that is
Yeah,
the point of those phrases like trans women are women or trans men are men or whatever, because they realize that everyone does know this innately instinctively and at that gut level. But they're trying to change that narrative. And this also harkens back to a cringe post we had a long time ago where someone said, "Yeah, the term biological male is offensive." And back when that originally hit me, that was, I think, the first time I'd ever heard that that was offensive. And it just goes to show how quickly things have progressed since then, because now I recognize what I didn't see at first then, which is to say biological male or biological female is to acknowledge that there is an immutable distinction between the two. There's nothing that they can do that will make them a biological male or a biological female. By saying that, it is the equivalent of saying man or woman prior to this, right? It's the equivalent of saying something you are not, or a distinction. This person is this thing and not the other. And so acknowledging that striking reality is offensive to people who don't want that reality to exist. And so I think that with time, can change, but I think that it is incumbent on people who value truth to speak out so that it does not change. Um, the 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 other thing about it too, when he's talking about like when we would simply say man or woman, but we say trans man just like we say imitation crab. I think about also things that are less permanent that people do to change their appearance and their forms. When, for instance, when a woman dyes her hair to go blonde, she's like, "Oh, I'm gonna be blonde. I'm gonna go blonde." But no one actually thinks, "Oh, you are a blonde person born with the blonde traits, and now any characteristics that people joke that you can make blonde jokes, about them, but no one in their logical sound mind would think my preconceived notion about blonde people being a little bit more ditzy now applies to this person who has chosen to dye their hair blonde. Like no one actually would think that hold any preconceived notions about that. Now, it can change how you might physically appear, and so there is on that level, like, yeah, you are blonde in the sense that you have changed your appearance there, but it would not be proper to say that you are a person who was born blonde with the genetics of blonde hair. But also, no one would be offended if you had to specify that and say, well, the biological brunette over here. No one would be offended by that. They would, you be. In fact, many people voluntarily clarify that. They'll say, "Oh, well, I'm not a redhead um, naturally, but I dye my hair because I like how I look this way." And there's no shame in that. There's no covering. There's no defensiveness. And the reason is because we're all acknowledging reality in the same plane here. And there's something that is uniquely harmful to me about the trans movement, where my more libertarian inclinations say things like, if a consenting adult wants to perform a weird operation on their own body, that's one thing. Or if they want to dress and act a certain way, like, they should be free to. But the problem is that culturally this isn't being sold as that. It's not being sold as, hey, do what you want. It's being sold as, do what you want, and you are always what you are meant to be felt. This is an irreversible thing. This is who you are. It's not like a, hey, dress up as someone of the other gender if you want to. It's saying, no, if you feel that way, that is your reality. And that is the pernicious harm, when they're actually trying to distort the truth and bend truth to their to the false conventions. That is where the biggest harm is, and why I can't just go supporting the idea of, oh, transition if you want, you're a free consenting adult. I have to speak out against at least the idea of it to some degree, because the culture is changing what is true, and what the definitions of that even mean. Um, which makes it far different than something like dyeing your hair, putting on makeup,
sure.
wearing a certain shade of clothing or whatever.
Yeah, and I don't think that, like you mentioned, like, oh well, my libertarian mind says to let people be that way or that whatever. It's like, well, I think the libertarian perspective is like, we don't want the government legislating that we have
Yeah.
to throw people that identify this way off of a building, right, as they
Yeah.
would in another
Right.
country or something like that. But I mean, we conservatives will still say like, well, isn't this examples that like the government needs to step in? It's like, well, yeah, I mean, look at how well it's done, right? Like we had a conservative president and a conservative Congress and a conservative Senate in place, and look what they did. They maybe forestalled it for a year or two, and here we are, in the same place that we were inevitably headed. And then you now look at like the private backlash towards Bud Light and towards Target. And it's like, oh yeah, now like less and less companies. I remember seeing a picture of like June 1st logos in 2022 versus June 1st company logos in 2023. And it's like most companies are not going into this whole pride thing because they are terrified of the free market retaliating against them. And so it's like, yeah, like the free market and like decency and private people of their own volition voluntarily saying like, no, we don't want to do this and we don't like this. It actually works, right? We're seeing it actually play out. And just like, again, like we talk about time horizons with the left, just because it doesn't work right away doesn't mean that it's not working, right? It might take some time, and cultural things take time. So this again, we should have TJ back on at some point because he's just I don't know what takes we'd choose, but I would love to see his perspective on stuff, especially from his perspective as a pastor and things like that.
Absolutely right. I think I'm good on this unless you have any last thoughts.
I'm good.
All right. Well, with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Make sure to give us a like or a follow if you enjoyed this and share with your friends. Helps us out a ton. And we'll catch you on the next one. Take care.